G'day guys and welcome, my name is Michael and I am the Dead Aussie Gamer, here to share with you my tips, tricks, ideas and strategies for playing and running tabletop role-playing games. Today we're going to be talking about firearms in fantasy games. Now, as of the release of this video, Paizo has just released their Guns and Gears playtest, which features the Gunslinger and the Inventor classes for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, I'm super excited about these, but before I kind of got too deep into it, I kind of had these PTSD flashbacks about Pathfinder 1st Edition and all of the arguments I ended up having about whether or not firearms even belong in a fantasy game. So I thought now is a great time to release a video talking about where firearms fit in fantasy, what are people's problems with it, and how you might be able to overcome some of those issues. So let's start from the beginning. Now, firearms for me are not just about the actual weapon, right? It's not just about how much damage it does and the fact that it's got a massive range and that anyone could use it. You know, it's nothing about that. For me, firearms represent something else. It represents innovation and technology. And that inherently has always been the enemy of fantasy. In a fantasy setting, it is about magic and wonder and amazement and mystery, the supernatural elements behind the Wilder Wilds where one only can imagine the true mysteries that lurk there. Whereas innovation is all about finding those mysteries and dissecting it, pulling it down and ripping it apart until it's understood in a clear, concise, and logical way. This is what innovation brings, and this is what technology brings. And a lot of people say that innovation is the death of magic. So as you can imagine, when you're playing in a fantasy game, having something kill off magic, well, unless you're playing in a specific type of fantasy game, it kind of ruins the take. It ruins the vibe and the narrative, right? Or it could at least. But that being said, there are tons of ways that firearms work in a fantasy setting. Chief among it, I think, is it represents a smaller portion of a fantasy world in which maybe magic wasn't as a reliable source for the people to be able to use. Pathfinder's world of Golarion has the area known as the Mana Wastes, where two wizards warred in this area until anti-magic basically made using spellcasting impossible. Thus, technology developed and firearms were born in this very area. For me, that is a great example of how firearms could belong in fantasy. It is a place for people who don't have magical abilities to fight back with something. That was cool. I like that. In areas such as Lantan, it's a great way to create and establish technologically savvy races. In the Forgotten Realms, the gnomes were a very, very innovative race. And what better way to say that than with their clockwork mechanisms? Even the town of Lantan was a mechanical marvel itself. This builds and develops the world as part of the technological growth, comparing both the main fantasy, kind of castles and kingdoms and horses and crossbows, literally juxtaposed to the cities and the rails and the automobiles and the flying blimps. The juxtaposition made that fun and interesting. Some integrated, making them one and the same. Eberron, for example, another great system that uses both magic and technology and places them hand in hand in their world. Anyway, I could go on. There are countless examples of where they can exist together. But let's say that you as an individual are interested in playing a gun-wielding, gun-toting individual. Well, what's the first thing that jumps into your mind as soon as you think of guns? That's right. It's probably either a soldier, a cowboy, some sort of battle-hardened individual. Guns have a certain sexiness when they're applied to experts, right? That's just how it always is. You don't want to play someone who's trying to figure out guns, it's like, oh, okay, do I put the pointy end that way, No one ever wants to play that level of kind of gunslinger. They always want to play someone who's a skilled expert. And the problem with that is that comes with its own territory. It comes with its own genre, right? If you have a group of adventurers, let's say that you've got a fighter, a barbarian, a cleric, a wizard, and up the back you have John Wayne, right? Just walking down, hips as far apart as they can, clotting up behind. It's like, damn, last time when we went down that crypt, them skeletons really got the jump on us. Good thing I had old Bessie here, You can obviously see there that the stylistic choices made in representing a firearm wielder can often conflict with the vibe that the GM might be trying to make within the narrative. So what do we do to combat that? Well, we, instead of using firearms, use crossbows. Now, bear with me for a moment. If you take your character and replace in your mind the design of that character as though they're wielding a crossbow instead of a gun, then you're usually going to be in a safe place for a fantasy games for two reasons. One is that by doing this, it means that if your GM turns around and says, no, sorry, no firearms in my setting, cool, you are a crossbow sniper and you are a crossbow wielder, or you use two-hand crossbows. Fantastic. That is the way that you adjust. The second is you're also less inclined to fall on those stereotypes that come along with firearms. You know, the big aggressive dude with the big honking gun. You don't necessarily need to fall into that if in your mind you're imagining you're wielding a crossbow. So there are two very strong positives for considering that. Also, spoiler alert, the playtest actually uses crossbows and firearms together for the class for just that reason, which I was very, very impressed with, by the way. I love it. It's one of my best bits of advice. If you can't play this character wielding a crossbow, generally speaking, you're going to be in danger. So there you go. Number two, what else can you do? Well, always remember that when you are using a firearm, it is not about pulling yourself as far away from combat in order to make use of whatever range your gun happens to have. In fact, what you should be able to do is consider the fact that you've got an incredibly loud weapon. Play with that idea. Play with the notion that this character is, of course, yeah, sure, maybe a little bit brash, maybe a little bit reckless, but is not a stealther, not someone who's kind of trying to sneak around. How does that fit into this world? How does that fit into your particular adventure? Play that together with it, because what could end up happening is creating a dynamic between the people who are traditional fantasy characters, swords, shields, longbows, and stuff like that, and your character, but there's a mutual understanding that my character doesn't just resort to the gun every single chance I get, because I know that we need some stealth. So I'm going to pull out my combat knife from my boot and I'm going to go kill things. I'm going to do other things as well. Be versatile, I guess, is my advice for if you want to use firearms. All right. Now, if you're a GM and you have a person who approaches you with the idea of firearms, it is your right to say no. And players, do not try to get the aha moment with your GM by saying, but firearms do belong in this setting. Look, you're using the Forgotten Realms. Here's where they are. And oh, look, here's where they are in Dungeons and Dragons. And here's where they are in Golarion. Whatever. Don't do that. As a GM, they always have the right to be able to determine what is and isn't going to work for their narrative. But as a GM, it is your prerogative to give a fair shot to at least hear out the character being brought up. Now, if I started a game and said no firearms, and someone said, but I've got a guy with a firearm, okay, fair enough. You don't have to hear that out. But if you said, hey guys, we're going to make characters, we're going to make, this, that, and the other, and this is the adventure, and someone says, I've got a character, but he's got a gun, hear out the idea. You'll never know when an idea is really going to strike a chord with you, and maybe this is the actual character that is going to prove to you that you don't have to play with John Wick every time someone makes a pistol-wielding lunatic. But that being said, always listen to them. Always listen out. Because the thing is sometimes, a player who is hooked on an idea struggles to get rid of that idea if they don't feel like they've been heard. And if you really don't want firearms, just listen. And if you still don't like the idea, then tell them no. Easiest thing you're going to do. All right. How do we put aside our own differences? So let's say, for example, someone actually does come up with a decent idea. Or you're one of those GMs who says, why not have firearms? Why can't we look at this? Well, one of the great things that you can do is look at how firearms can be integrated into your world. You don't necessarily need to look at firearms and say, well, now my character, this PC here, is going to be the only person within the next few kingdoms to wield this magic stick that shoots out metal. Instead, incorporate it into your world. Replace a few longbows with a couple of rifles. You don't have to make the entire militia wield them. But yeah, among the longbowmen, there's like 4 people with muskets. Sure, it's a specialty weapon, but we do have people and soldiers who wield it. Have a couple people have pistols. Have a few individuals understand the notion of black powder. Maybe even have the miners and the dwarves use black powder for demolitions and for their own works in the quarry. Incorporate black powder and guns and that level of technology into the world around you. Not only will it make it feel a little bit more lived in, it'll also help you avoid feeling like that player is just an isolated entity in your role-playing game. Lastly, you want to also look at the level of technology. Now, if you're playing in a traditional fantasy game, I always recommend early firearms. Early firearms for me are so sexy in fantasy games. A lot of people turn around and say, but what about my 6-shooter revolver? And what about my my submachine gun and all this other stuff? I'm like, you know what? Nothing for me is more appealing than having a weapon that has a single shot that you need to make, you know? I love the idea of a sniper with this huge musket. There's a single shot and you have to make it, because if you don't, by the time you reload, they're going to be all over you. So it ups the pressure, it ups the risk, it ups the ante, it makes it so much more, like there's just so much more to the earlier firearms than in the future. In the future ones, you've got your cartridges and your multi-shots and stuff like that. I mean, they're great, they're fine, and it does a lot more damage, and big numbers are big numbers. But it kind of just becomes samey. It becomes like a longbow and its bow and arrow. You kind of lose that vibe, I guess. And that's just my personal feelings. I think in a fantasy game, early firearms are always the best to use, but some people might want to improve on those. If you want to improve on those, like let's say you want a 6-shooter, don't do it with technology. Embrace the fantasy and offset the innovation. You now have an enchanted pistol that now can reload itself as a free action. You can do this 6 times before you actively need to put a new bullet in. Or you've got a magic rifle that actually has a magic kaleidoscope kind of thing, and it'll actually locate the living or the dead within your sight. Add magic to these elements, right? Because if adding firearms can diminish the magic of fantasy, then by the same logic, adding magic to your elements of innovation and technology should bring out more of that fantasy as well. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please, of course, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, bang on that bell to get notifications. And if you want any more advice on firearms in fantasy, leave some chats in the comments below. I love hanging out with people and saying hi. Thank you so much. Come check us out on Twitch, where you can watch me apply most, if not all, of the advice I give at twitch.tv/DeadAussieGamer. Until next time, guys, as always, from me to you, game hard or die trying. Bye, everyone.